You have zero authority over my property. The words exploded from my throat as I stood face to face with Margaret Chen in my driveway, my hands shaking with rage I could barely control. She didn't flinch, just crossed her arms over her expensive silk blouse and smiled, that infuriating smile that said she owned this entire neighborhood, including me. Actually, Brenda, as HOA president, I have every authority. That eyesore you call a garden violates Section 12.4 of our community standards. It's coming down today. Behind her, 3 workers with shovels stood waiting beside a massive excavator, its diesel engine rumbling like a threat. My heritage rose garden, the one my grandmother had cultivated for 40 years. The one with bushes older than Margaret herself was about to be ripped from the earth because this woman decided it was 2 inches too tall. You touch one plant, and I'm calling the police. My voice cracked. But I didn't care. Neighbors had started gathering on their lawns, phones out, recording everything. Margaret leaned closer. Her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for me. Go ahead and call them. Sweetheart, by the time they arrive, your precious roses will be mulch. And you'll be writing me a check for $18,000 in violation fees. She gestured to the workers. Gentlemen, proceed. That's when I understood this wasn't about garden regulations or community standards. This was war. And Margaret Chen had made the fatal mistake of thinking I wouldn't fight back. The nightmare had started 4 weeks earlier when I returned from visiting my daughter in Seattle. I'd been gone for 3 weeks, helping her with her newborn twins, barely sleeping, living on coffee and grandmother's joy. The drive back to Phoenix in mid-November 2024 had been long, but I'd been eager to get home to my house in the Desert Springs community, to my quiet routine, to my roses. I pulled into my driveway on a Tuesday afternoon. The Arizona sun still blazing, even though it was nearly Thanksgiving. Everything looked normal at first glance. My modest 2-story house with its terracotta roof stood exactly as I'd left it. But as I stepped out of my car, something felt wrong. The air itself seemed different. Heavier, somehow. Charged with a tension I couldn't immediately identify. Then I saw it. My garden. The beautiful heritage rose garden that had been the pride of this property for 4 decades was surrounded by orange construction fencing. Not just casual fencing either. Industrial-grade barriers staked deep into the ground with violation signs zip-tied every 3 feet. My grandmother's climbing roses. Her hybrid teas. Her David Austin English roses. All caged like criminals. My heart hammered as I rushed to the fence. Attached to my front gate was an official-looking document in a plastic sleeve. Rainproof and impossible to miss. Notice of violation and compliance order screamed across the top in bold red letters. I ripped it free and read with growing disbelief. Property owner, Brenda Sullivan. Violation. Unauthorized landscaping exceeding height restrictions per HOA. Covenant Section 12.4. All plantings exceeding 36 inches must be removed immediately. Estimated removal cost, $18,000. Failure to comply within 72 hours will result in HOA-mandated removal at owner expense plus administrative fees. Contact Margaret Chen. President. $18,000 for roses my grandmother had planted. I read it 3 times. Each pass making my blood pressure climb higher. The 72-hour deadline was dated from 2 weeks ago. During my time in Seattle, I'd never received any warning, any email, any phone call, nothing. Just this notice slapped on my gate while I was 2 states away helping my daughter. I immediately called the number listed for Margaret Chen. It rang 4 times before connecting to voicemail. Her voice was smooth, professional, dripping with the kind of authority that came from years of telling people what to do. You've reached Margaret Chen, president of Desert Springs HOA. Please leave a detailed message and I'll respond within 2 business days. 2 business days. My supposed deadline had already passed 2 weeks ago. This is Brenda Sullivan at 4217 Saguaro Lane, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. I just returned from Seattle to find my garden fenced off and a violation notice demanding $18,000. I was never contacted about this. I need to speak with you immediately. I left my number and hung up, staring at my imprisoned roses. I'd lived in Desert Springs for 16 years, ever since inheriting this house from my grandmother after she passed. She'd moved here in 1978 when Phoenix was still relatively small, when this neighborhood was brand new and the HOA was just a handful of neighbors making sure everyone kept their yards neat. Over the decades, she'd cultivated this garden into something extraordinary. These weren't Home Depot roses. These were rare heritage varieties, some dating back to the 1800s. The Lady Banks rose, climbing over the trellis, was nearly 40 years old. The Madame Isaac Pereire bushes had been propagated from cuttings her own grandmother had brought from Louisiana in the 1930s. This garden was living history, and according to Margaret Chen, it was a code violation. I spent the next hour photographing everything, documenting the fencing, the notice, every angle of my garden. My background wasn't in law or landscaping, but I'd spent 35 years as a medical records administrator before retiring. I understood documentation. I understood procedures, and I understood that something about this situation was deeply wrong. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and the HOA covenant documents I'd received when inheriting the property. I'd never paid much attention to them before. Desert Springs had always been a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where people waved to each other and complained about the heat, but generally left each other alone. The HOA had been practically invisible for years, just collecting minimal dues to maintain the community entrance sign and organize an annual 4th of July barbecue. But apparently, things had changed. I found Section 12.4 on page 47 of the Covenant. Landscaping aesthetic standards. All front yard plantings must maintain visual harmony with surrounding properties. No vegetation shall exceed 36 inches in height within 15 feet of the property line without prior architectural review approval. 36 inches. 3 feet. My roses, when blooming, reached 6 to 7 feet easily. Some of the climbing varieties went to 10 feet on their trellises. But this rule clearly stated without prior architectural review approval. Had my grandmother obtained that approval back in the 1980s, I had no idea. The paperwork that came with the house had been minimal, mostly just the deed and title documents. I looked at the violation notice again. Nowhere did it mention whether an architectural review had been conducted. Nowhere did it explain who had complained or why this was suddenly an issue after 4 decades. And most troubling, nowhere did it explain how they arrived at an $18,000 removal cost. I emailed Margaret Chen that night, keeping my message professional but firm. Ms. Chen, I left you a voicemail earlier today regarding the violation notice on my property. I need clarification on several points. 1. Why was I not contacted before this notice was posted? 2. What is the basis for the $18,000 removal estimate? 3. Was any architectural review conducted? And if so, can I see the documentation? 4. These roses have existed for 40 years. Why is this suddenly a violation? I'm requesting a meeting to discuss this before any removal action is taken. Sincerely, Brenda Sullivan. I attached photos of the violation notice, the fencing, and several shots of my garden from different angles showing the roses in their current late autumn state. Mostly dormant, but still beautiful. Then I waited. Margaret's voicemail had promised a response within 2 business days. It was Tuesday evening. That meant I should hear something by Thursday, at the latest. Thursday came and went with silence. Friday passed without any response. By Saturday morning, I was furious. I drove to the address listed for HOA meetings on the covenant documents. A small office suite in a commercial plaza off Tatum Boulevard. The door was locked. A sign read, "Office hours by appointment only. Contact Margaret Chen." I was being stonewalled. Deliberately, systematically ignored by someone who had already posted a violation notice, fenced off my property, and demanded thousands of dollars in compliance costs. This wasn't bureaucratic oversight. This was strategy. Sunday afternoon, my phone finally rang. Unknown number. Phoenix area code. "Hello, Brenda Sullivan. This is Margaret Chen returning your call." Her voice was exactly as smooth as her voicemail, with an edge of impatience. "I'm sorry for the delay, but as a volunteer HOA president, I do have other commitments. Thank you for calling." I said, keeping my tone controlled. I have serious concerns about this violation notice. First, I was never contacted before. The notice was posted on your property in accordance with covenant procedures. Margaret interrupted. All required protocols were followed. I was out of state for 3 weeks. I never received. That's not the HOA's concern. Brenda, property owners are responsible for monitoring their properties regardless of travel schedules. The violation has existed for years, but we're now enforcing standards consistently across all properties. Something in her phrasing caught my attention. Existed for years. These roses have been here for 40 years. If they've always been a violation, why wasn't this addressed decades ago? Margaret's sigh was audible and condescending. Previous board administrations were lax in enforcement. Under my leadership, we're ensuring all properties comply with covenant standards. Your roses exceed height limits. They need to be removed or severely trimmed back. And the $18,000 cost. How was that calculated? That's the estimate from our contracted landscaping company for complete removal and disposal of the vegetation, plus soil remediation and resodding of the affected area. Soil remediation. These are roses, not toxic waste. Old rose bushes have extensive root systems that damage irrigation lines and create subsurface issues. Margaret replied, her tone suggesting she was explaining something to a child. Professional removal requires proper equipment and expertise. The estimate is reasonable for the scope of work required. I don't accept that this is necessary at all, I said, feeling my composure slipping. These roses have historical and sentimental value. My grandmother's sentiment doesn't override covenant obligations. Margaret cut in again. Look, Brenda, I understand this is difficult, but rules are rules. The garden needs to come into compliance. You have two options: hire your own contractor to do the work and provide proof of completion, or allow the HOA's contractor to handle it at the estimated cost. Either way, this needs to be resolved. What if I refuse? The pause that followed was pregnant with meaning. When Margaret spoke again, her voice had shifted from merely condescending to openly threatening. Then, the HOA will place a lien on your property for the removal costs plus administrative fees and accrued interest. Eventually, if the lien remains unpaid, we can force a sale of the property to satisfy the debt. I don't think you want that. Brenda, not at your age. Not with your fixed income. My breath caught. How did she know about my retirement, about my income? That sounds like a threat. Margaret, it's not a threat. It's the legal reality of covenant enforcement. I'm actually trying to help you avoid escalation. Work with me here. Get the roses removed. Replant with something appropriate. And we can put this behind us. And if I want to contest this violation, you can request a hearing with the HOA board. But that will take 60 to 90 days to schedule. In the meantime, daily fines of $50 will accrue for continued non-compliance. That's $1,500 per month. Brenda, do the math. I did the math. 3 months of fines would be $4,500 on top of the $18,000 for removal. Margaret was systematically eliminating any option except immediate surrender. I'll be in touch. I managed and ended the call before she could respond. I sat in my kitchen for 20 minutes, trying to process what had just happened. This woman, this HOA president I'd never even met before today, had effectively declared war on my property and my finances. And she'd done it with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how much power she wielded. That evening, I started doing research. Real, deep research into Desert Springs HOA, Margaret Chen, and my legal options. What I discovered over the next week would change everything. Margaret Chen had become HOA president 18 months earlier, in May 2023. Before that, Desert Springs had operated with minimal oversight. The kind of casual neighborhood governance that worked when everyone generally got along. But Margaret had brought corporate efficiency to volunteer administration. According to meeting minutes I found buried in the HOA website, she'd immediately implemented new policies, mandatory compliance audits for all properties, contracted enforcement partnerships with local vendors, streamlined violation procedures that bypassed traditional warnings, and increased fine structures to encourage immediate compliance. In her first year as president, violation citations had increased by 600% compared to the previous 5 years combined. The HOA had collected over $200,000 in fines and compliance fees, money that previously would have been minimal. And the contracted landscaping company she'd mentioned, its business registration listed Margaret's husband, David Chen, as the CEO. My roses weren't a code violation. They were a business opportunity. I found 14 other properties that had received similar violation notices in the past year. Most had complied immediately, terrified by the large estimates and the threat of liens. 2 families had tried to fight and ended up paying even more in accumulated fines and legal fees. One elderly couple had actually sold their house rather than deal with the stress and expense of the violations Margaret had manufactured. This wasn't about community standards. This was systematic profiteering using HOA authority as a weapon, targeting vulnerable homeowners who didn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively. Margaret had turned neighborhood governance into a protection racket, and she'd gotten away with it because most people either couldn't or wouldn't challenge her. But I wasn't most people, and I wasn't going to let my grandmother's legacy be destroyed by a corrupt HOA president running a scam. I spent the next 3 days preparing my counterattack, documenting everything I'd found about Margaret's enforcement patterns, researching Arizona HOA laws and homeowner rights, and consulting with a real estate attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. His name was Robert Hernandez, a man in his 50s with a calm demeanor and sharp eyes that had clearly seen this kind of situation before. "How much do you know about HOA law in Arizona?" he asked during our initial consultation in his downtown Phoenix office. "I know that HOAs have legal authority to enforce covenants," I admitted, "but this feels wrong. The timing, the cost estimates, the threats, all of it." Robert nodded slowly. Reviewing the documents I'd brought, Arizona has some of the most homeowner-friendly HOA laws in the country. But most people don't know that. HOAs count on ignorance. Let me ask you something crucial. Did your grandmother ever get architectural approval for these roses? I don't know. If she did, I don't have the paperwork. That's actually fine, because the burden of proof is on the HOA, not you. Arizona law requires HOAs to prove a violation exists and was never approved after 40 years. If they can't produce documentation that these roses were planted without approval, they're going to have a very hard time enforcing retroactive compliance. Margaret said previous boards were lax in enforcement. That's legally irrelevant. There's a doctrine called selective enforcement and another called estoppel by acquiescence. Basically, if an HOA allows a condition to exist for an extended period and 40 years definitely qualifies, they can be legally barred from suddenly enforcing it, especially if the homeowner relied on that acquiescence. Your grandmother invested decades and significant money into this garden based on the HOA's implied approval through inaction. Hope flickered in my chest. So I have grounds to fight this. You have excellent grounds. But Brenda, I need to be clear about something. Fighting an HOA isn't just about being right. It's about having the resources and determination to outlast them. HOAs have collected dues from every homeowner. They can afford extended legal battles. Can you? The question hit hard. My retirement savings were comfortable but not unlimited. Extended litigation could drain tens of thousands of dollars with no guarantee of recovery, even if I won. What are my options? I asked. 3 paths. 1. You comply with the violation and preserve your resources. 2. You request a formal hearing with the HOA board and try to resolve this through internal processes. 3. You file a lawsuit challenging the violation and Margaret's authority. Each path has different costs and risks. What would you do? Robert smiled slightly. I'd start with path 2 and be fully prepared to escalate to path 3 if needed. Request the formal hearing. Force Margaret to present her case in front of the board and other homeowners. Make her justify these numbers and this enforcement pattern publicly. Sometimes sunlight is the best disinfectant. If she can't or won't, that becomes evidence for a lawsuit. If she continues threatening you, that's harassment. You can document. And if she retaliates, then she digs her own grave deeper. Retaliation against homeowners for exercising their rights under the covenant is illegal in Arizona. Any adverse action she takes after you request a hearing becomes potential evidence of bias and abuse of authority. I left Robert's office with a strategy and renewed determination. Margaret Chen had power. But she wasn't untouchable. She'd made a crucial mistake by targeting someone who had both the motivation and the means to fight back properly. That evening, I composed my formal hearing request, citing the specific covenant provisions that guaranteed homeowners the right to contest violations before the board. I kept my language professional but firm, requesting a hearing within 30 days as required by Arizona law, documented evidence of the claimed violation and the basis for the $18,000 estimate, proof that these roses were planted without approval or that approval had been revoked, and an explanation for why enforcement was only occurring now after 40 years. I sent it via certified mail to ensure Margaret couldn't claim she never received it. Then I sent copies to every HOA board member whose contact information I could find through public records. Margaret's response arrived 6 days later, and it revealed just how seriously she took challenges to her authority. Dear Ms. Sullivan, your hearing request has been received and will be scheduled at the board's earliest convenience, which may be 60 to 90 days depending on agenda availability. In the meantime, the violation remains in effect and daily fines continue to accrue. As of today, you owe $2,300 in late compliance fees, in addition to the original $18,000 removal estimate. I strongly encourage you to resolve this matter before costs escalate further. Respectfully, Margaret Chen. HOA, President, $2,300 in less than 3 weeks. Margaret was deliberately dragging out the hearing process to maximize financial pressure, betting that I'd break before the hearing ever happened. It was textbook extortion wrapped in procedural language. But her letter contained a critical mistake. By stating the hearing would be scheduled at the board's earliest convenience rather than within the 30-day time frame Arizona law required, she'd given me grounds for legal action. I forwarded her response to Robert Hernandez immediately. His reply was succinct. She just violated state law. We now have basis for emergency injunctive relief. If you want to escalate, I can file tomorrow. I thought about it for an hour. Escalation meant legal fees. It meant public conflict with my HOA. It meant becoming the neighborhood troublemaker in the eyes of people who just wanted quiet, suburban life. But it also meant standing up against corruption and protecting something that mattered not just to me, but to the memory of the woman who'd raised me. File it? I told Robert. The lawsuit hit Desert Springs HOA like a bomb. Robert filed for emergency injunctive relief in Maricopa County Superior Court, asking the judge to halt all violation fines and enforcement actions pending resolution of my hearing request. The filing included my documentation of Margaret's enforcement patterns, the suspicious business relationship between the HOA's contracted landscaper and Margaret's husband, evidence of selective enforcement targeting elderly homeowners, and Margaret's violation of Arizona HOA law by refusing to schedule a timely hearing. The judge granted a temporary restraining order within 48 hours, freezing all fines and prohibiting the HOA from taking any enforcement action regarding my property until a full hearing could be held. The order specifically criticized the HOA's scheduling delay as inconsistent with Arizona statutory requirements for homeowner due process. Margaret was livid. I know this because she called me at 7:30 in the morning 3 days after the court filing. Her professional composure completely abandoned. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she shouted into the phone. "You've tied up the HOA in legal proceedings over your stubborn refusal to follow simple rules. This is going to cost thousands in legal fees that could have gone to community improvements. Improvements like your husband's landscaping contracts." I replied calmly. The silence that followed was electric. "What are you implying?" "Brenda, I'm not implying anything. I'm stating that Desert Valley Landscaping, the company you've been using for all these violation compliance projects, is owned by David Chen. Your husband? That seems like a significant conflict of interest that was never disclosed to homeowners. David's company provides competitive rates and quality service. At $18,000 to remove some rose bushes, Margaret, I've gotten estimates from 3 other landscapers. The highest quote was $4,500. You're inflating costs by 400% and funneling that money to your family business. That's a serious accusation. It's a factual observation. One that will be presented at the hearing your board is now legally required to hold within 30 days. Margaret's voice dropped to something cold and dangerous. You're making a terrible mistake. When this is over, you're going to regret ever challenging me. Is that a threat? Margaret. Because my attorney is recording this conversation, I wasn't actually recording. But the bluff landed perfectly. The call ended abruptly. 4 days later, I received notice that the HOA board hearing was scheduled for 18 days from receipt, meeting the legal 30-day requirement. The notice came with an attachment. Margaret had prepared a 60-page document alleging not only the rose garden violation, but 14 additional supposed violations of my property I'd supposedly committed. Mailbox paint color, incorrect. Front door wreath, unauthorized. Holiday decorations displayed outside approved time frame. Garage door left open during daylight hours. And more. It was obvious retaliation. Margaret was trying to bury me in paperwork and multiply the potential fines to force settlement. But she'd made another critical error. Arizona law specifically prohibited HOAs from raising new violations once a homeowner initiated legal proceedings regarding existing disputes. Every one of these new allegations was legally inadmissible and further evidence of harassment. Robert Hernandez actually laughed when I forwarded him Margaret's document. She's self-destructing. This is perfect evidence of retaliatory conduct. We're going to eviscerate her at the hearing. The 18 days leading up to the hearing were tense. I documented everything. Every interaction. Every new notice Margaret tried to post on my property. I gathered support from other homeowners who'd been targeted by her enforcement schemes. I prepared my presentation for the board meeting, including photographs of my garden through the decades, evidence of my grandmother's care and investment, and documentation of Margaret's conflicts of interest. But Margaret wasn't idle either. She was organizing her own campaign. 1 week before the hearing, I found a flyer in my mailbox, professionally printed on glossy paper. "Community Standards Matter," read the headline. Above a photograph of my rose garden shot from an unflattering angle that made the bushes look overgrown and chaotic. The text beneath outlined how one homeowner's refusal to maintain property standards threatened everyone's property values. Warned about the cost of legal fees being passed to all residents through increased dues. And encouraged neighbors to attend the upcoming board meeting to support covenant enforcement. Margaret had weaponized the neighborhood against me. The morning of the hearing, my stomach churned with anxiety. Robert had warned me this would be confrontational. that Margaret would have supporters, that the board might be predisposed to side with their president. But he'd also assured me that the legal facts were overwhelmingly in my favor. Remember, he'd said during our final preparation meeting, this isn't really about convincing the board. This is about creating a record for the lawsuit if they rule against you. Stay calm. Present your evidence. And let Margaret's own conduct speak for itself. I arrived at the Desert Springs Community Center at 6:45 for the 7 o'clock hearing. The parking lot was already packed. Through the windows, I could see dozens of people inside. Far more than typically attended HOA meetings. Margaret had definitely rallied her supporters. Walking in felt like entering hostile territory. Conversation stopped as I appeared. Eyes tracked my movement to the sign-in table where a board secretary whose name I didn't know greeted me with professional coldness. Brenda Sullivan, you'll be presenting during item 4 on the agenda. Please take a seat. The meeting room was set up like a courtroom, with a long table at the front for the 5 board members, rows of chairs for attendees, and a podium facing the board for speakers. Margaret sat at the center of the board table, flanked by 4 other members I recognized from the neighborhood but had never spoken with directly. Robert Hernandez arrived at 6:55, impeccably dressed and carrying a briefcase that looked expensive. His presence seemed to shift the room's energy. Several board members exchanged glances. Margaret's expression hardened. At 7 exactly, Margaret called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of a gavel I didn't know HOA presidents even used. Good evening. We have a full agenda tonight, so let's proceed efficiently. Item 1. Approval of previous meeting minutes. All in favor, the routine business items took 15 minutes. Financial reports. Landscaping contract renewals. Pool maintenance schedules. Every approval was unanimous. Every vote swift. The board operated like a well-oiled machine, with Margaret conducting from the center. Finally, she reached item 4. Violation hearing. Property address 4217 Saguaro Lane. Owner Brenda Sullivan. Ms. Sullivan has challenged a violation notice regarding non-compliant landscaping and has filed legal action against the HOA seeking to invalidate enforcement procedures. We'll hear from both sides tonight and render a decision. Margaret looked directly at me. Ms. Sullivan, you have 15 minutes to present your case. I stood and walked to the podium, my folder of documents feeling heavy in my hands. The room was completely silent. Every eye was on me. Thank you. My name is Brenda Sullivan, and I've lived in Desert Springs for 16 years after inheriting my home from my grandmother, who lived here for 40 years. Before that, the rose garden that Ms. Chen has declared a violation has existed since 1978. My grandmother cultivated heritage roses, some dating back over a century. This garden represents not just landscaping, but living history and her life's work. I displayed photographs of the garden through the decades, including pictures of my grandmother tending the roses, images from neighborhood garden tours in the 1980s and 90s, when this garden was featured as a community highlight, and recent photos showing the current state of the roses. For 40 years, this garden has existed without any HOA objection. Previous boards approved it through their continued acceptance and even promoted it as an example of Desert Springs beauty. That creates legal precedent called estoppel by acquiescence that bars retroactive enforcement of violations. Margaret's expression remained neutral, but I noticed one board member, an older man named Harold, studying the photographs with interest. Beyond the legal issues, there's a fundamental question of fairness and proper procedure. I received no warning before this violation notice. I was out of state for 3 weeks and came home to find my garden fenced off and a demand for $18,000. When I requested documentation and a hearing, Ms. Chen delayed and retaliated by inventing 14 additional violations that conveniently appeared only after I filed legal action. I laid out the timeline of events, showing Margaret's systematic stonewalling, her refusal to schedule a timely hearing, and her retaliation with new violation allegations. Most concerning is the financial conflict of interest. The landscaping company Miss Chen wants to hire for this $18,000 removal is owned by her husband, David Chen. I have estimates from 3 other reputable landscapers ranging from $3,000 to $4,500 for the same work. This appears to be a scheme to funnel HOA money to a family business through inflated enforcement actions. That caused a stir in the audience. Several board members leaned forward. Margaret's face flushed red. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for the same respect my grandmother received for 4 decades. I'm asking for enforcement of HOA laws that require proper procedure and fair treatment. And I'm asking this board to reject Margaret Chen's abuse of her position for personal profit. I concluded and returned to my seat. Robert gave me a small nod of approval. Margaret stood. Her composure recovered, and her voice sharp with controlled anger. The allegations Ms. Sullivan has made are slanderous and false. Desert Valley Landscaping was selected through competitive bidding, and my husband's ownership is disclosed in all contract documents. The fact that Ms. Sullivan finds the pricing unreasonable doesn't make it improper. She clicked through a PowerPoint presentation showing the violation notice. Photographs of my garden from angles that emphasized height and sprawl, and text of the covenant provisions regarding landscaping standards. Section 12.4 is unambiguous. Vegetation exceeding 36 inches requires architectural approval. Ms. Sullivan has provided no evidence such approval was ever granted. The burden is on the homeowner to demonstrate compliance, not on the HOA to prove violation after 40 years of records. Margaret's presentation was polished, professional, and completely ignored the selective enforcement and conflict of interest issues I'd raised. This isn't personal. This is about maintaining community standards that protect everyone's property values. If we allow one homeowner to ignore covenant requirements, we undermine the entire system. Ms. Sullivan has chosen confrontation and legal action instead of simple compliance. That choice has cost this community thousands in legal fees that could have been avoided if she'd just followed the rules. She sat down to scattered applause from her supporters in the audience. Harold, the older board member, raised his hand. I have questions for both parties. Margaret, you mentioned competitive bidding for Desert Valley Landscaping. Can you provide documentation of that bidding process? Margaret hesitated for just a fraction of a second. The bidding records are in the HOA office files. I can make them available after the meeting. And the architectural approval Miss Sullivan mentioned. Do we have any records regarding this property from the 1970s or 80s? Records from that period are incomplete. We transitioned to digital storage in 2005, and many older documents were lost. Harold nodded slowly, then turned to me. Ms. Sullivan, You mentioned your grandmother received approval through acceptance and promotion. Do you have documentation of the HOA featuring this garden? Yes. I pulled out copies of old Desert Springs newsletters from 1986 and 1992 that featured photographs of my grandmother's roses, with captions praising the garden's contribution to neighborhood beauty. The newsletters created visible impact. Several board members examined the copies closely. Margaret's jaw tightened. The board deliberated for 45 minutes in a closed session, while attendees waited in tense silence. When they returned, Harold spoke instead of Margaret. The board has carefully considered both presentations and the legal issues raised. While we recognize that the current garden configuration exceeds strict interpretation of height limits in the covenant, we're troubled by several aspects of enforcement in this case. First, the 40-year existence of this garden without objection creates ambiguity about whether it was ever formally approved. Given incomplete historical records, we cannot definitively prove violation. Second, the timing and method of enforcement raise concerns about procedure, particularly given Ms. Sullivan's absence during initial notice. Third, the board shares concerns about potential conflicts of interest in contracted services and commits to reviewing procurement policies. Margaret's face had gone pale. This wasn't the vindication she'd expected. Therefore, we rule that the current violation notice is withdrawn. Ms. Sullivan may maintain her garden in its current configuration. However, we request that she voluntarily trim plants to reasonable heights that maintain visual harmony with neighboring properties and submit a formal architectural application documenting the existing garden for future reference. Relief flooded through me so intensely I felt dizzy. I'd won. Not completely, but substantially. My roses were safe. Margaret looked like she'd been slapped. She'd lost control of her own board. The meeting adjourned in chaos. Margaret's supporters were furious, shouting about selective enforcement and favoritism. Other homeowners who'd been targeted by her schemes approached me with thanks and questions about challenging their own violations. Robert Hernandez fielded questions from several board members about the legal issues he'd raised. And Margaret herself stormed out without speaking to anyone, her expression promising that this battle was far from over. She made good on that promise exactly 6 days later. I woke up on a Saturday morning to the sound of heavy machinery in my front yard, groggy and confused. I threw on a robe and rushed to my front door. Through the window, I saw an excavator positioning itself at the edge of my rose garden. Its massive bucket raised like a weapon. 3 workers in Desert Valley landscaping uniforms were removing the orange violation fencing. Margaret Chen stood on my lawn directing operations, clipboard in hand, looking for all the world like she owned the place. I burst through my front door, not even bothering with shoes. "What the hell are you doing?" That's when Margaret delivered the line that would define our entire confrontation. "Actually, Brenda, as HOA president, I have every authority. That eyesore you call a garden violates Section 12.4 of our community standards. It's coming down. Today." The board withdrew the violation, I shouted. "You have no authority to. I have a separate enforcement action based on new evidence of irrigation damage and property line encroachment. This is a legitimate safety issue that requires immediate remediation. The board's ruling last week doesn't apply to newly discovered violations." She was lying. Obviously. Blatantly lying. But she had workers and machinery on my property right now. prepared to destroy my garden while I stood in my bathrobe and bare feet on my own lawn. You touch one plant, and I'm calling the police. Margaret smiled that infuriating smile. Go ahead and call them. Sweetheart, by the time they arrive, your precious roses will be mulch, and you'll be writing me a check for $18,000 in violation fees. She gestured to the workers. Gentlemen, proceed. That's when neighbors started appearing. Mrs. Patterson from next door. The Johnsons from across the street. Harold, the board member who'd questioned Margaret at the hearing. People with phones out. Filming everything. The excavator operator hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the growing crowd and obvious tension. Ma'am, do you have documentation that we're authorized to work here? He asked Margaret. Because the homeowner is claiming this isn't approved, I have HOA enforcement authority. Margaret snapped. That's all the authorization you need. Actually, I'd like to see written documentation before we destroy anything. The operator replied. He'd clearly dealt with property disputes before and wasn't willing to risk liability. Margaret's confident facade cracked slightly. She rifled through her clipboard. Producing a document, she thrust at the operator. He examined it, then looked at me. Ma'am, do you consent to this work? Absolutely not. This woman is trespassing and ordering destruction of my property without legal authority. The operator shut off his excavator. I'm not touching anything without clear authorization from the property owner or a court order. This is a civil dispute, and I'm not putting my company in the middle of it. His two coworkers nodded agreement and started packing up their tools. Margaret's face went from pink to deep red. You're under contract with the HOA? You take your orders from me? We take orders that don't expose us to legal liability? The operator corrected. This situation is too disputed. We're leaving. He and his crew departed within minutes, loading equipment while Margaret argued and threatened to their retreating backs. That left just Margaret and me on my lawn, surrounded by filming neighbors and the wreckage of her attempted enforcement action. This isn't over. Margaret hissed. You think you won because the board caved to your lawyer tricks. I'll make your life hell in this neighborhood. Every single violation, every minor infraction, every blade of grass too tall, I'll document and fine you for it. You'll spend so much on legal fees fighting me that you'll wish you'd just cut down the roses when I first asked. Are you threatening me? Margaret, I kept my voice clear and loud enough for all the phone cameras to capture. I'm promising you that challenging HOA authority has consequences. She turned and walked to her white Lexus parked on the street, driving away with a tire squeal that suggested barely controlled rage. The neighbors who'd witnessed everything gathered around me. Some supportive, some uncomfortable, all clearly shaken by what they'd seen. That was insane. Mrs. Patterson said, she really thought she could just destroy your property. Margaret's lost it. Harold added, her behavior is completely inappropriate for an HOA president. I'm calling an emergency board meeting to discuss removal. But not everyone was supportive. Mr. Chen from 2 houses down, no relation to Margaret despite the shared surname, looked at me with disapproval. You're tearing this neighborhood apart with your stubbornness. Margaret was trying to enforce rules that protect all of us. Now we'll be tied up in more legal battles instead of focusing on community improvements. The room erupted in arguments. Margaret's supporters shouted about Harold's bias. Her opponents demanded immediate resignation. The meeting devolved into chaos for 10 minutes before Harold restored order by threatening to adjourn without action. We will now vote on a motion to remove Margaret Chen as HOA president for conduct incompatible with her duties. Board members, the vote was 4-1, with Margaret herself casting the only vote against her removal. She was out. Margaret stood, her expression a mixture of humiliation and rage. This is political retaliation, and you're all going to regret it when the lawsuits start piling up. I dedicated 2 years to this community, and this is how you repay me. By believing a troublemaker who can't follow simple rules, she stormed out, her attorney struggling to keep up while trying to prevent her from saying anything else that could be used against them in court. Harold was elected interim president that evening. His first action was to initiate a complete audit of all HOA finances and contracts from Margaret's tenure. His second action was to reach out to Robert Hernandez about settlement discussions for our lawsuit. We want to make this right. Harold told me in a phone call the next day, Margaret's conduct was unconscionable. The HOA will cover your legal fees, issue a formal apology, and establish new policies to prevent this kind of abuse. Will you consider settlement instead of trial? I wanted vindication. I wanted Margaret to face consequences in court. But I also wanted this nightmare to end so I could return to peaceful retirement in the neighborhood I loved. What happens to Margaret? I asked. The lawsuit against her personally will continue, but the HOA is separating ourselves from her defense. She's on her own for her actions. And the roses. The board formally recognizes your right to maintain the garden in perpetuity. We'll even amend the covenant to grandfather in pre-existing landscaping to prevent future boards from attempting similar enforcement. It took another month to finalize the settlement agreement, but when it was done, I'd recovered all my legal costs plus $25,000 in compensation for the stress and property damage attempts. The HOA implemented strict conflict of interest policies and enforcement procedure reforms. And most importantly, my grandmother's roses were legally protected forever. Margaret Chen's personal consequences were devastating. The audit of HOA finances revealed she'd steered over $300,000 in contracts to her husband's company over 18 months, with pricing that averaged 280% above market rates. Criminal charges were filed for fraud and embezzlement. Her husband's landscaping company collapsed as the scandal became public and municipalities across Phoenix terminated their contracts with Desert Valley Landscaping. Margaret pleaded guilty to reduced charges 9 months after her removal as HOA president. She received 3 years of probation, was ordered to pay restitution of $95,000, and lost her environmental management certifications. Her LinkedIn profile, which once boasted about community leadership and environmental stewardship, disappeared entirely. The divided neighborhood slowly healed, though some relationships remained fractured. Jessica Miller never spoke to me again after realizing the property value decline she'd blamed on me was actually due to Margaret's documented fraud that made Desert Springs infamous. Other neighbors who'd supported Margaret quietly apologized once the full scope of her corruption became clear. 6 months after everything ended, I stood in my garden on a beautiful February morning, pruning my grandmother's roses in preparation for spring blooming. The Lady Banks rose was already showing the first yellow buds that would explode into thousands of flowers in a few weeks. The heritage hybrid teas my grandmother had babied for decades were healthy and strong. Harold walked by on his morning jog and paused at my fence. Beautiful as always. Brenda, your grandmother would be proud that you protected her legacy. I almost didn't. I admitted. Margaret's intimidation tactics nearly worked. If I'd had less retirement savings or less stubborn pride, I might have just let them destroy everything rather than fight. That's how corruption succeeds. Harold said, "It counts on good people being too tired or scared or isolated to resist. You fought back. And that protected not just your roses, but every homeowner in this community from similar abuse. That matters." After he jogged off, I sat on my grandmother's old bench beneath the climbing roses and reflected on everything that had happened. Margaret had weaponized community authority for personal profit, counting on fear and ignorance to prevent resistance. She'd almost succeeded because most people didn't understand their rights or have resources to defend them. But when challenged by someone who had both knowledge and determination, her entire scheme collapsed spectacularly. The roses she'd tried to destroy were still blooming. The legacy she'd attempted to erase remained intact, and the corruption she'd believed untouchable had been exposed and punished. Sometimes standing up to bullies with authority meant risking isolation, financial stress, and community division. But sometimes it also meant protecting what mattered most and preventing future victims from suffering similar abuse. My grandmother's roses would bloom for many years to come, a living reminder that some things were worth fighting for. Even when the odds seemed impossible and the cost appeared too high, Margaret Chen had learned that lesson the expensive way, and Desert Springs would never forget it. The morning newspaper landed on my driveway with its usual thud. I retrieved it with my coffee and found the story I'd been expecting on page 3 of the local section, "Former HOA President Begins Community Service for Fraud Conviction." The photograph showed Margaret Chen picking up trash along a Phoenix highway in an orange safety vest. Her expression defeated and hollow. Justice had been served. Not perfectly. Never perfectly, but sufficiently. I folded the paper and returned to my roses, breathing in the sweet scent of a grandmother's love that no corrupt HOA president could ever truly destroy. The garden had survived 40 years of Arizona heat, multiple droughts, and countless challenges. It would survive long after Margaret Chen's brief reign of terror had faded into cautionary tale status. And that was enough.